What's up guys, it's me, Jeremy. Lucian's a champion that was released on August 22nd, 2013, and ever since he was released, and had a couple of minor bug fixes, he's been a huge factor in the meta for AD carries, and even now we're starting to see him played in solo lanes a bit here and there. And Lucian ended up being a super fun to play AD carry, but he wasn't always going to be the way that he ended up. And as with every champion, Lucian went through a bunch of different development cycles and redesigns, and so join me today in taking a look back through his development story to find out what Lucian could have been. And if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, and if you don't, hit that dislike, because I'm actually in Canada right now in Vancouver for my sister's graduation from university, and if this video hits 10,000 ratings, I'm gonna buy myself some good old Tim Hortons. Actually, just kidding, I'm already buying some for myself every day when I'm here, so you know what, just enjoy the video. Lucian's development began with an idea piece of concept art from Ewan Colgan that completed in the summer of 2012. Ewan is a concept artist who works on pieces for random characters to present to the champion design team, and a lot of the time, the characters stick out as just being super awesome, and so a designer will then take the concept art piece and build a character off of that. Ewan is responsible for the art from Aatrox, Draven, Fiora, Varus, and Zed, as well as the Lucian piece. This concept art had actually been leaked to the public in late 2012 or so, but it didn't really affect his development, so we're not going to talk about that leak too much. Anyway, the designers loved the Lucian piece, and they had the idea floating around about the whole kind of concept of the characters from movies like The Matrix and Equilibrium. And they loved the archetype of martial arts using weapons, and they wanted to create their own version of the weapons that existed in those types of movies. And from the concept, they knew straight away that he was going to be a very intense and dark type of character, and with the gameplay design of dealing damage while moving. They wanted an AD carry who would be swift and involve a lot of movement and positioning gameplay, as well as just blasting people non-stop. At the time, they were focusing a lot around the Shadow Isles, and they wanted a character who would directly oppose the other characters from the Shadow Isles, and so they began to work on the gameplay for the champion under the name of Lucian the Gun Templar, with the idea that he was going to be released around the same time as Thresh, who was currently being developed at the same time. And Riot Xenon is quoted for saying that Lucian's design concept was always the strongest aspect of his design, so it didn't really change all that much from its conception, other than just some minor tweaks here and there, and maybe the renaming of his title from the Gun Templar to the Purifier. So once they had settled upon the concept for Lucian's character and personality, they began to work on his gameplay. And throughout the initial design for Lucian's gameplay, the designers had a really difficult time capturing the personality and theme that Lucian needed to be successful. On one hand, you have the thematics of his design wanting this action-packed kind of gameplay, like the action scenes from in the movies, but they also wanted to capture a more auto-attack focused style to make the gameplay as a marksman a little bit more unique and interesting. And the designers struggled a lot from the lack of direction to take his gameplay. That was the main challenge that they faced. Lucian wasn't a character that could just randomly have two guns. He needed to prove in his gameplay that there was an expert in martial arts behind the weapons to back it up. And after a while, they had some version of Lucian that showed a little bit of potential, but a month before his release, the design team got together and decided that Lucian just wasn't as fun to play as he needed to be, and the gameplay just didn't really click in the way that it needed to make Lucian a successful champion. And so he was pulled from the launch schedule and would go on to receive a massive delay in order to make the mechanic of dealing damage while moving fulfill the design fantasy for what they wanted to accomplish. And based on the idea that Lucian had been planning to release sometime around the time that Thresh was, this delay for a complete redesign of Lucian's gameplay would go on to last for about 7 additional months, on top of the time that they had already spent developing him up to that point. And throughout both of those development cycles, Lucian had a ton of scrapped abilities that never made it into his current design. It's not entirely clear which abilities lined up to which development cycle in the timeline, but they did try a lot of different variations for his gameplay, and let's run through about as many as we know, starting with the passive. Lucian had a total of 3 different passives during his development. For a majority of the development, his original passive was that killing a unit would reset his auto-attack timer. They really needed an ability that would accomplish this double gun kind of feeling, and that was the design that they started out for that idea, but it didn't really work that well, since resetting your auto-attack timer isn't actually that fast, since you have to wait for the first bullet to land to kill the unit to actually fire another one. So this type of ability wouldn't really feel like you had 2 guns, just that if you killed a unit you maybe had a small boost in attack speed. And from there, Riot Xenon talked to a bunch of other champion designers and got a couple of okay ideas, until he talked to Riot Certainly T who suggested the idea of giving each gun its own independent auto-attack timer. And that design of the two guns working separately from one another, as well as the idea of having two auto-attack timers, was one that Xenon really gravitated towards and tested out. However, it proved to be kind of ridiculous, and as a result it required Lucian to have extremely low attack speed and attack speed scaling for this passive to actually be balanced, otherwise he was just an 80 carry with literally double attack speed for free. And so they did have to give him a huge hit to the attack speed and the scaling to actually make this ability possible, to make it fair, and as a result it ended up feeling pretty clunky and bad and just lackluster and wrong for the gameplay of being this swift and intense dual gun wielder. And as for the third passive that Lucian had during his development, we don't know exactly what it did, but Ride Xenon is quoted for saying that it turned League as we know it upside down, so I imagine that it was probably scrapped pretty quickly, and he also mentioned that it just didn't fit the theme of the champion, and eventually they settled upon the double shot passive that he has now to accomplish that two guns kind of feeling really well. As for Lucian's Q, during early playtests he had a lot of different abilities that featured like a double skill shot kind of effect that would shoot out two lasers in different directions. And although there were a lot of other strange double skill shots that were pretty easy to dodge, and we don't really know the exact specifics for how those double skill shots worked, but they just didn't work out in his kit, and overall they were pretty much all fairly underpowered. Although they did fit really well thematically and they were pretty cool, they just didn't work for his gameplay design, and when it comes to champions, although Riot does want the thematics of the abilities to be as awesome as possible, Riot designers definitely believe that sacrificing theme for fun and just better gameplay is always worth it if it's actually necessary. And as a result, during the playtest with that version of Lucian's kit, he was really missing a reliable source of consistent damage since they were skill shots, and as well it felt that he could really benefit from an ability that was almost like a trick shot kind of thing, that was maybe a little bit different from missile based skill shots in the sense that it's still aimed, but it doesn't really behave like a normal skill shot would where you just shoot it out. And so they settled upon an ability that Riot Skarzard described as being a combination of Misfortune's Double Up and Sivir's Ricochet, and it really needed to be almost impossible to dodge, otherwise it just felt way too frustrating to play with. And eventually they began to really embrace the idea of Lucian using a target to aim his laser and then firing it regardless as kind of like a pseudo skill shot almost that was still possible, albeit incredibly difficult to dodge. And from there it became much more fair to play against, and so they really embraced the ability and kept it in his kit. For his W, we don't have too much information, just that the star animation was how the ability began. One of the gameplay artists named Casey made this super badass star explosion kind of thing, and then Riot Xenon made a skill to fit it, and it gave it some mobility and some interaction elements to make it fit well gameplay wise. And as for his E, unfortunately I don't have anything, so it's likely that this ability went through little to no iterations in terms of overall design, maybe just some minor mechanics tweaks here and there, although I can't entirely say for sure. And now we're finally at his ultimate. Lucian had a total of 5 different ultimates during his development that were scrapped, and we have specific information on at least a few of them. The first version of his ultimate was just a straight up buff, a passive buff, that allowed him to move and attack and cast all of his abilities at the same time, to literally allow him to just straight up deal damage while moving. It fit great with the whole theme that they were going for, since it was just straight up giving what they wanted his theme to be, but it was pretty overpowered and it was also incredibly difficult to use, and so they knew that they did want to keep that same thematic feel, but they just needed to use different mechanics to do so. Another version of his ultimate was like this targeted ability where you would target someone, kind of like a Caitlyn ultimate, and then you would shoot out a missile at them that would collide with the first enemy hit in any direction. But after 1 second, the missile would turn in a direction of the targeted opponent, like a homing missile kind of, and that missile would rotate a maximum of 15 degrees every quarter of a second. And once it was finally in a position that was a straight line towards the initial target, it would accelerate but also stop rotating altogether, and then it would explode on impact, dealing tons of damage. And this ability was actually a skill shot. It was designed to have the counterplay of being able to dodge it once it reached the state where it was no longer rotating. So it was kind of like his Q in the sense that it was like a targeted ability that was also a dodgeable skill shot, although it was probably still pretty difficult to dodge due to the acceleration on it, and it was especially broken when you had an ally to keep the enemy in place since it did tons of damage. So it was like a homing missile kind of effect. You could curve it around minions, maybe around the enemy tanks, the enemy frontliners, and the designers said that this ultimate was super fun and awesome to use and to play with, but it was really difficult to make it both reliable for the Lucian player to land and fair for the opponents to dodge it at the same time. And in the end, the ability also just didn't make sense in Lucian's gameplay design. It was an ability that was a much better fit for a mage type of champion, so maybe we'll actually see this version of Lucian's scrapped ultimate on a future mage champion. And so they took a little bit of inspiration from his Q of the idea of a missile-based skill shot that was something you aimed, and settled upon the concept of an ultimate that was a hail of bullets that he could cast while moving, which fit great thematically, and gave him a great way to deal damage while moving to give him that really slippery feel that he needed in teamfights. But it did take a couple of iterations to get him to where it is now. In one of the earlier versions of his kit, the one where I mentioned earlier where he was missing a reliable source of damage, that version of his ultimate was initially super overtuned to the point where in a fight, it was dealing as much as 80% of his overall damage in his ability combos, and it would just totally shred people. It could kill tanks by itself probably, and definitely squishies for sure, and as a result his basic abilities were forced to deal little to no damage to be pretty much useless to make his ultimate actually balanced, and of course, having his 4 other abilities or 3 plus the passive feel useless was not that fun at all, so his ultimate had to be toned down a lot to make him more fun and more fair. There was also a version where he was able to recast the ultimate during its duration, so you could cast it once and then cast it again to change the angle of it after already casting it initially, and this wasn't entirely broken actually, since his ultimate had to be weaker as compensation. It ended up just being really unhealthy since the counterplay of being able to dodge his ultimate in the first place is really important to make the ability fair, and adding a little bit of risk into the ultimate allowed them to make it stronger and have a shorter cooldown and actually just be more fun to use as a result, and eventually they settled upon the version of the culling that is in the game today. And as well, another thing that happened with Lucian is that during the majority of his development, his particles looked really prismatic with way more colors than he currently has now. They were also super noisy, but it was also a bit too similar to Lux's animations, so they decided to limit the color scheme to the blues and the yellows that he has now, and they felt that it communicated his effects in the same way, while also being more unique and more visible. And once all of his abilities and animations had been ironed out, Lucian would go on to finally get released. He's probably my favorite AD carry in the game, at least in terms of how fun they are to play, and although his alternate designs during his development were super awesome, he ended up being released as a pretty damn fun champion, and the designers really captured the gameplay style that they were going for. Anyway, looks like that's it for me today. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop that like, subscribe if you want, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.